Hello, everyone. I think we're going to get started, so if you could take your seats. Hello, and welcome to New Canaan Library and to the 10th Annual Anita Houston Memorial Lecture with Sarah Chayes. My name is Crystal Chumney, and I'm the head of Adult and Public Services here at the library. As always, we are glad you are here, and thank you for supporting our wonderful programs. It is through the generosity of members such as yourselves that we are able to provide enriching programs, lectures, and workshops to our community. As a courtesy to others, please silence or turn off your electronic devices and hold all questions until the end of the talk. Now, please join me in welcoming Katherine Houston Bradford, who will speak about this lecture series and Anita Houston's legacy.
My mother, Anita Houston, would be so happy to see this room, this full room on a Sunday afternoon. She loved New Canaan. She loved her New Canaan friends. She loved the New Canaan community. And best of all, she loved talking about international affairs. So today, I'd really like to thank the UN Committee of New Canaan and the New Canaan Library, and especially Pete Runette, for putting all this together so that we could come and listen to a really interesting speaker. I have two sisters and a brother, and right now, I'm going to take a picture of you all to show them.
I'm the Pete Runette. On behalf of the New Canaan UN Committee and my co-chair, Shakeba Bennett, of the Next Generation, we welcome you all, and we'd like also, on behalf of the committee, to thank the library and Crystal Chumley for being really very proactive partners and great co-hosts of this series of lectures. For a 10th anniversary, we thought you needed something special, and I think you'll find we've delivered today. Sarah Chayes is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in the Democracy and Rule of Law program. She's internationally recognized for her innovative thinking on corruption and its implications. Her latest work, Thieves of State, which will be for sale outside. Why corruption threatens global security, and explores how severe corruption can help prompt such crises as terrorism, revolutions, and their violent aftermaths, as well as environmental degradation. Before joining Carnegie, and from 2010 toward the end of nearly a decade of living and working in Afghanistan, Chayes became special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. This followed her work as special advisor to two successive commanders in the International Security Assistance Force of in Afghanistan, or ISAF, namely Generals McChrystal and Petraeus. Having written, quote, a comprehensive action plan for Afghanistan, unquote, in early 2009 for ISAF, she focused with Mullen on governance issues. She further contributed to strategic U.S. policy and participated in cabinet-level decision-making on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Arab Spring. She traveled with Mullen frequently to these regions. In 2002, after covering the fall of the Taliban for NPR, she chose to remain in Afghanistan to help rebuild the country. She settled in Kandahar, southern Afghanistan, the former Taliban heartland. In 2005, Chayes founded a startup manufacturing cooperative where men and women working together produce fine skincare products. The goal was to revive the region's historic role in exporting fruit and its derivatives and expand alternatives to the opium economy. Clearly, her education, a master's in Islamic history from Harvard, journalism experience, command of the language, and assimilation into the local culture commended her to the American military leaders of ISAF, and subsequently to her role as special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. At the completion of her service, she received the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff Distinguished Civilian Service Medal. Along with Thieves of State, which won the 2016 Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Chayes is the author of The Punishment of Virtue, Inside Afghanistan After the Taliban. She's also contributed to Foreign Policy Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, The Atlantic, Washington Post, among other outlets. From 1996 to 2001, Chayes was NPR's Paris correspondent. For her work during the Kosovo crisis, she shared the 1999 Foreign Press Club Award and Sigma Delta Chi Awards. She graduated magna cum laude from Harvard with a degree in history and was awarded the Radcliffe College History Prize. She then served the Peace Corps in Morocco, returning to Harvard to earn her master's in medieval Islamic history. She speaks Pashto, is fluent in French, and speaks some Arabic. I only wish Anita were here, as we're about to enjoy a treat she would really appreciate. Please welcome a very special speaker and author, Sarah Chayes.
So you all know Pete. So you know that I don't need to lay it on too thick about what he's like and how too kind he is and how persistent he is. So really a big hand to Pete for making these things happen. And I'd also like to say that it just really moves me to see a room full of people on the Sunday of a holiday weekend listening to somebody like somebody talk to you. And it is something we Americans still do, and I hope that that instinct or tradition will help us navigate what lies ahead. Because I think we're in for some times, it's clear that we're in for some times that will require a lot of every one of us, whoever we may have voted for. What Pete said about me basically can be boiled down to having a raggedy CV. And I'll leave that at that for now, because what I'd really like to do, and I know this talk is kind of, it uses the word corruption, but I really want to try to broaden the angle and talk about corruption without even using the word, but describing it in a slightly different way. And I think in a way that places the United States within what I see as a trend globally. So I took place last week in the rollout of the National Intelligence Council's Quadrennial Global Trends report, which is a really interesting piece of work because it's unclassified. It's based on a lot of research and interviewing outside of the classified channels. And it's sort of a look forward, but it's really meant to be a thought provoker. It's not a prediction. It's, here are the trends as we see them, and based on these trends, things could go in the next 20 years one of three ways, is kind of how they put this. And so the type of trends they talked about, well, where did it go? Were some of them not particularly surprising. Rich populations are aging, poor populations are not. Likelihood of persistent, slow economic growth, at least into the near-term future. Technology is both a vector of progress, but also of, this is a great intelligence word, discontinuities. Read, disaster. Interestingly, ideas and identities are vectors of exclusion. The nature of warfare is changing, boy. Climate change and environment are increasingly important in terms of shaping likely scenarios. And then they kind of, as I say, sketch out three potential scenarios. So I wanted to add a trend, and let me kind of try to walk you through it because it's got pieces to it. Based on both what I experienced in Afghanistan and what I've seen in researching corruption thereafter, it seems to me that since the 1980s, there has been a trend of the reduction of the notion of value to exclusively material terms. Now, it's not to say that hasn't always existed, but I'm feeling a collapsing of the types of things that one can be admired for in society, increasingly toward the amount of money one has. And I think we can see it in the United States. I have relatively recently moved from many years overseas to living in the Washington area. I went for a 60-mile bike ride one day. I took the metro out as far as it would go, and then did a 60-mile loop going out from there and then back into the city. I never escaped McMansions in 60 miles. That has happened since the 1980s. That's not what the environs of Washington looked like in 1970. I spent 2.5 weeks in Nigeria speaking with Christians and Muslims, poor people, less poor people. I asked everybody 2 questions. One was, what are the characteristics of a good person? For you to consider somebody good, what are the characteristics? And then the second question I asked was, has the meaning of money changed in your lifetime? The kind of social meaning of money. It was so fascinating. The responses I got were so emphatic and so articulate and so surprising, many of them. For example, I would hear people use money to oppress people. And I would say, okay, what do you mean by that? By giving money to someone, you can oppress them. I said, wow. And they would say, because if someone gives you money, then you can't criticize them anymore. It's a way of taking away almost your critical apparatus or your independence of mind. So I think that's happening kind of worldwide. To compete in this race, because if this is how one is valued socially, then people start competing in that race, meaning the race to get zeros in your bank account, right? Elites around the world, in developed and developing countries, across party lines, across ethnic lines, across religious lines, are doing 2 things. They are rewriting rules, and they are selectively enforcing rules in ways that favor their interests. That's happening everywhere. The result, almost everywhere, oh wait, let me stop and just pause on this a second and say, this process is a public-private partnership. This is not just elites in government, it's not just elites in business, it's actually interconnected and indeed including criminal elites. I mean, outwardly, like in-your-face criminal, like drug dealers and stuff like that. So that has been what I've been working on for about the last 2 years, is really exploring, so that's where we get to kind of corruption, not as an individual doing something, venal in an opportunistic way, but rather the operating system of integrated networks that weave together public sector, private sector, and criminal sector elites. And it's really confusing because we have a tendency, we're Americans, right? So we spend a lot of time arguing about who's worse for your health, the public sector or the private sector, right? We love to have that argument. And what I'm saying is very often these are so woven together that those distinctions are almost immaterial. And it's been really interesting to drill down. I'm working on a case study on Honduras right now, where those 3 sectors are quite evenly balanced, actually. And the interconnections are profound, and it creates a resilience. It's woven like a basket, and a basket is something that's both light and flexible, but quite strong. And actually, one of your number reminded me that there's a very significant element to this process, which is enabling institutions on the outside of a system like that. So if I look at Honduras, for example, I also have to look at development financial institutions like the International Financial Corporation attached to the World Bank or various bilateral development banks that are putting development money into this type of situation, thinking that the private sector is somehow agnostic. It's, oh, that's not political because it's the private sector. But if the private sector is woven into a basket that is rewriting and enforcing rules in its interests, then if you provide loans into that system, you are actually enabling it. And enablers can take a whole range of forms. They can be active facilitators, like, does anyone remember the Panama Papers? Yeah, right? That's a service provider, right? I mean, Mossack Fonseca is an active, service provider to these types of systems. Okay, so that was my little pause on what these systems look like, and I'd love to go into that a little more deeply if you want to. But what's happening as a result? Populations, again, around the world are getting indignant. They're getting absolutely indignant. And we can just look at the number of anti-corruption protests that have broken out in the last couple of years. Brazil, Guatemala, Honduras, Malaysia, Moldova, Lebanon, Iraq, South Africa, South Korea. I could go on and on. I mean, it's kind of impressive. And then you can even think back to the Arab Spring. For Mullen, I spent a month going across North Africa in the eye of the Arab Spring. And I was amazed at how explicitly an anti-corruption movement it was. I mean, people were walking around with signs that showed ministers behind bars. They were absolutely explicit about our elites are behaving in criminal ways and need to be held to, judicial account. Maidan revolution in Ukraine similarly. Next element of this trend, to manage or exploit this indignation, the elites themselves or spoilers are making use of legalisms. So let's just think about the conversation we've been having, in the last couple of weeks about, quote, conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is a very sterilized word to talk about the kind of criminal activity I'm referring to here. Or let's think about, do any of you remember the McDonnell decision that the Supreme Court handed down last June? Okay, I live in Washington, D.C., and this guy was the governor of Virginia. This was the guy who got convicted on corruption charges for doing pretty blatantly corrupt stuff, right? Like taking $185,000 worth of goods and services in return for setting up meetings, for this businessman. The Supreme Court not only threw out that conviction, it threw it out unanimously. And at least in our talk shows in Washington, you couldn't get a pundit to raise an eyebrow about that, because the answer was, oh, well, if he was going to be convicted on corruption for that, the whole city would be, and the answer is, that's right, right? But the grounds on which that conviction was thrown out were incredibly legalistic. The question was not, was there a quid pro quo? Was there an exchange? Which already is too narrow. I mean, everybody knows a gift economy works. Pete doesn't give me $100,000 and I sign a contract that I will vote the following ways on the next 3 bills. That's not how corruption works, right? It's much subtler than that. But they even showed quid pro quo. What they didn't quite do to the Supreme Court's satisfaction was show that McDonald had performed an official act. So it all came down to what is the definition of an official act. And setting up a meeting in the governor's mansion didn't count as an official act. It had to be either signing a bill or doing something that was literally in his job description. And that's why 8 Supreme Court justices out of 8 threw out this conviction. So that's what I mean by legalisms. They also make use of nationalist or identity rhetoric. So Putin is a really good example of that. I would say that Secretary Clinton's active going after specific identity groups kind of counts in that category too. And I would say that Mr. Bannon's effort to sort of generate a sense of white identity is also an example of that. Or they make use of ideals-based rhetoric. And one of the arguments I make in Thieves of State is that a lot of extremist Islamist organizations are actually using ideals-based rhetoric. And it's very hard for us, I think, to metabolize that. I see a frown right here. But it's actually anti-corruption rhetoric. And what they're kind of saying is the only way to get integrity in public office is to have strict, by the imposition of strict moral standards on a personal level. Now, one can question the version of morality. But what I do in Thieves of State is actually show a parallel with the early Puritans who were lashing out. If you go back and read the 95 Theses, it's all about corruption. And so what led us to, the Protestant Reformation, but some pretty extreme versions in the early days of it, and pretty bloody, was a very similar or parallel idea that you get public integrity by way of the imposition of very stringent standards of private morality. So by using some of these instruments, the elites get temporary quiescence on the part of, the elites that manipulate these types of instruments often get temporary quiescence. I think if you look at Russians who very recently were in the streets in droves against Putin, but now seem to kind of have come around, I think he has very skillfully played with some of these techniques to bring them into line. Or you get insurrection. And that insurrection takes a lot of forms, like revolution, like I just described, like joining extremist movements, and like voting for, what's the word I might use? I don't really like the word populist, but demagogic political movements, which we're seeing all the way across Europe, and I think I would submit that we've seen it in the United States. Many of us reinforce parts of this trend. So, for example, the Global Trends Report itself uses the word growth, economic growth, just as an automatic positive. Let's think about that for a moment. Don't we all know by now that it's not the amount of growth, it's how growth is distributed that really matters? It's the structure of growth that really makes a difference, and arguably badly imbalanced growth may actually be a vector of insecurity and conflict rather than being a vector of stability and happiness and stuff like that. I would even argue that, this may be a really simple-minded analogy, but in a human body, when you have unchecked growth, it's called cancer and it's fatal. Right? We are living on a finite planet. How does it make sense that infinite growth, especially fueled by the kind of competition to get zeros in your bank account that I'm talking about, which compounds the infinite growth of a growing population with the infinite growth of an unchecked competitive environment? How is that a positive good? I can't figure out how that doesn't kill us. But that, again, maybe some of you can explain that to me. The report also interestingly sees ideas in exclusively negative terms. Now that's their trend, it's not their potential solution, but I believe that ideas, and I suspect if all of you guys are in here on your Sunday, you might think similarly, you know, ideas are a potential source of resilience if we get the right ideas. And ideas, therefore, in my view, need to be valued. It's just that they need to be carefully selected. I see in these trends that I've just outlined two potential opportunities. One is persistent slow growth. I think that's an opportunity because it may force us finally through the process of realizing we have to distribute it better. And as I say, I think it's the justice of the allocation of material goods that matters at least as much as their quantity. Secondly, I actually think the popular indignation that is bursting out everywhere is an unbelievable opportunity. The problem is that so far it's only been the elites and the spoilers who have captured it. We haven't seen a true reformer ever at least in this period since the 1980s, really capture this level of indignation. Or I would say the indignation didn't start to burst out until, I would say, the last 15 years or so. So here's what I think a real reform movement needs to encompass. And I think we need to understand this much more deeply than a typical period of political reform. I think it's cultural reform that we need. And it needs to include refraining from writing the rules of the political and economic game at home and abroad in ways that favor those who already have amassed excessive power in both realms. And that's a question of self-restraint. It means that the people who have, access to the rule writing need to decide not to do that. It means writing and enforcing those rules in such a way as to improve the material security and the other rewards to people who perform underappreciated social functions or who choose to place non-monetary values at the center of their action in life, right? And then it means developing an inspiring vision that really celebrates those values. Because that's what's going wrong, is there isn't an inspiring vision that's attracting people away from the spoilers and the materially driven elites. And this is kind of wonky, this is a little bit Nick intelligency, but it matters in government. We need to reform the way we think about and measure a successful society in line with this vision. Because so long as we say that growth is the kind of stand-in, the token for a successful society, that's what we're going to keep measuring, and that's what we're going to keep rewarding. So you really have to define what a society wants to aspire to be, and therefore what the citizens of that society want to aspire to be, and you need to measure and reward success on that scale. So with that, I will wind it up, and let's make this a conversation. Thank you very much indeed. So we have a couple of runners with microphones. So if you would be so kind as to wait until one of them. And I'm happy to go into more, this was a little bit theoretical, so if you want me to bring this down to the concrete, I'm happy to do that too. Ma'am.
Thank you so much for those wonderful comments. Is this working? It's working. Okay. I'm going to start with something which is elementary. You had stated in the beginning of your talk that you had spoken to a number of individuals and asked them what characteristic they most valued in a human being. Last week, Michelle Obama was asked that question, and her answer was to be kind, that it's really important to be kind as much as one can at all times to all people. I'm curious, what are some of the responses that you received from the people you spoke with?
I did get that a lot, being kind and generous. Now, generous was a slightly problematic one because, again, this is Nigeria. So sometimes the social value of generosity gets you into this material race again, because you are expected to provide material goods to someone, and they don't really care where you find it. But I got integrity, so I think that was a really important one that came up. I got wisdom. I've been reading a stunning book. All right, this is going to sound completely off the wall, but I've been reading a book about place names among the Western Apache. But what's absolutely fascinating about this book is it leads to a definition of wisdom, which is, and so what the Western Apache do is they have their kind of morality tales are embedded in landscapes. So when the elders tell a story which has a moral, character issue embedded in it. So what they don't criticize each other for you're being selfish. They would never do that. If someone's being selfish, they would tell a story about a selfish person who suffered for being selfish and expect the person to think about it. But they embed that story in a place, apparently. So what they do, are there any Apaches in the room? Is they start the story by saying it happened at New Canaan, except their place names are very descriptive, like it happened where the river stops and turns and hurries north. And so that embeds an image in somebody's mind, and what people will talk about is being stalked by a place, because every time they walk past that place, they think of the story, and they think of, oh my God, I behaved selfishly, and so it's a fascinating way of embedding or of having people think through precisely the question you asked. And wisdom, they talk about wisdom as having I'm going to change the language that was used in the book a little bit, but like an unencumbered mind, a mind that's sort of like a clearing that doesn't have a lot of obstacles in it, and a mind that's resilient like a basket, and a mind that's well-founded like a fence post. So that's a pretty deep, now I didn't have that conversation with the Apaches, but that is a deep notion of what the qualities of a good person are. Thank you. You're welcome.
Two things. Just on the last point you made, I happen to have a Persian wife.
Uh-huh.
And what I learned is that you get two older Persian gentlemen having a discussion about morality, and they will throw poems at each other all afternoon.
Right. Exactly.
Very similar
And
thing.
what's so interesting about that, and the same is true as I read about the Apache, and I think it's the same thing in the Persian tradition, the point is not having it spelled out for you. The point is having to ponder it a little bit. And so you think it through from your own perspective. And it can be, I do actually have an Apache friend, and we spent a couple of days together, and he was just, nonstop stories. And I couldn't figure out how to make head or tail of it. And it's only more recently that I've realized, wow, he was expecting me to think this through for myself.
The other separate point was what you talk about economic growth. It's been clear, it seems clear, that we'll consume ourselves to death here. Do you take any heart in the fact that millennials seem to be going the tiny house movement, the back to the bicycles, oh, I don't want to own a car, Do you take any heart in all that?
So I am quite obviously not a millennial. I'm quite obviously on the wrong side of 50, and I live in a small apartment, and I have a bicycle. Now, Pete knows that there may be a change to this situation, but I haven't owned a car. I mean, I did have a Taliban pickup truck in Kandahar. That was a lot of fun. I had a red pickup truck with the steering wheel on the wrong side and stuff like that. That was nice. But it was really interesting because my mother, who, by the grace of God, is still alive and had me when she was 35, so you kind of get the deal, she expressed recently this classic thing about, gosh, you know, my kids haven't surpassed my standard of living. And we finally kind of, you know, nailed her on it and said, you know what, it's a choice. We have chosen to live this way. And so I guess my question is, which millennials? How many of them? I mean, there are a lot of phenomena that become surprisingly newsworthy in the urban areas, but how are people elsewhere feeling, and what kind of cars are they driving? And does our infrastructure make it possible to live that way? You can live that way in a city. My younger sister has a car because she lived in Western Massachusetts for most of her adult life, and it was like, you cannot function here. Whereas in France, where I lived most of my adult life, you can. So the question is, are we as a society, I mean, as millennials start coming up, are they going to make demands about how collectively we spend our resources in ways that will make that lifestyle more possible outside of urban centers? Hi.
The global economy is obviously and very rapidly going digital, and yet cash never seems to go out of style. Now, you've spent your career researching these public-private criminal sector symbiotes, and what I'm wondering is, what is their currency of choice going forward? Is it cash, or some digital facsimile of it, or something we haven't seen yet?
Great question. So I love this question because I'm going to take you down another winding road, right? What's really interesting about money is that it has to serve two purposes, or we have made it serve two purposes. As a means of exchange, you want money to be as boring as possible. One of the big breakthroughs in the history of money was when the Athenian drachma became identical. Like every Athenian drachma was exactly the same weight and had the same owl on it and stuff like that, so that, you know, it becomes interchangeable. You also, if you're traveling, want it to be lightweight, portable, and again, kind of not attracting attention. So ideally, you want it to be invisible. Therefore, electronic money is the ideal, you know, sort of endpoint of this. Let me go back to Native Americans and say that, let's say between the Comanche, the Sioux, and the Crows, one of the ways that people showed prowess was by stealing, you know, the other tribe's horses. That was kind of one of the ways that men in these tribes competed. So you would often have quite small bands that were roaming around with a couple thousand horses, which they obviously didn't need, right? But by having a couple of thousand horses, it was really obvious that they had a lot of prowess. So the problem, if you're competing over money, the problem is that money to function well as a means of exchange has to be invisible, whereas to be a means of competition, it has to be visible. So how do you square that circle? You square that circle by converting money into visible objects. So let's take a $40,000 Philippe Patek watch. That watch's job is not to tell time. That watch's job is to say, I cost $40,000. That's its job. So my answer to your question is that it will be both. I mean, it will be increasingly invisible, but that doesn't matter. What matters, because in order to compete over zeros, the zeros can be made out of anything. It can be made out of Bitcoin, it can be made out of dollars, it can be made out of anything, but you then have to convert it into something visible and tangible. Two corollaries. One is, what was very interesting about the Comanches and the Crows and those guys is that they didn't get any credit, any social credit, for taking horses from a weak person. The only way they could get social credit for this is if the more of a warrior of prowess from whom they stole the horse or whom they killed, but killing the guy didn't matter. What mattered is you had to touch him with your coup stick first and then kill him. And you had to take the horse, again, ideally you take the horse out from under his nose. So you didn't get social stature by taking advantage of people's weakness. Whereas in the money competition, you do. And that was one of the really interesting answers I got from Nigerians about how has the meaning of money changed, is they said, when I was young, it really mattered where your money came from. To the point that, and they all had a story of where, not all, but at least half a dozen stories I got of someone who had found money on the ground or someone who had been given some money as a child, as an 8-year-old kid. I found some money on the ground. I was so scared to be caught by my parents with money that I couldn't explain where I got it from, that I gave it to like the first person who walked past, or remembering having been beaten for having money that they couldn't explain, or remembering having been taken in front of the elders by their own parents to explain where the money came from. Whereas now, people are exalted for money no matter where they got it from. So that's one corollary. The other corollary is, given the somewhat increasing scrutiny being applied to the movement of money by things like the US Treasury Department, but not only, there's going to be an effort to figure out another way to move value that is more invisible than moving it through the US financial system. So for example, in Honduras, every bank allows a person to open or can make it possible for a person to have a dollar account. Well, once you have money in dollars, it is within the jurisdiction of the United States government. So, a lot of drug dealers are a little uncomfortable about having accounts in dollars, but boy, see these winding paths? Then I go to the fact that every bank based on my experience of Afghanistan, any bank in Honduras that is solvent on drug money. The US, has just, or fairly recently, imposed sanctions on one of these banks, and I kind of know that there's probably 5 other banking families that are sweating bullets at the moment. Sir.
Hi. You say that what we're looking for is a reform movement, something that will really change the culture and the way of thinking. But it strikes me that one man's reform could be another man's continuation of the problem. For example, in the United States, the 49% of the people who voted for Donald Trump think he is a reformer, that he is going to throw out the scoundrels, that he is going to overturn a Washington elite that has been making this country go down the wrong path for the last 40 years. And yet other people think when he appoints people from Goldman Sachs or from Exxon, that he's put the wolves in charge of the hen house.
So my personal opinion is the latter. My personal opinion is that, and we're laughing, but what I think is so important about what I'm trying to say is that it's actually not a partisan issue. I think the elites in both parties have been going down this road, and I feel like the people who didn't vote for Donald Trump have been insufficiently examining their own elites, our own elites, right? For those of us who didn't vote for Donald Trump. And I think that people who did vote for Donald Trump, I see him as a spoiler who has exploited their justifiable indignation at the elitism of both parties, and I think, so I think their indignation is perfectly justifiable. I think they voted for a wrecking ball, just as my neighbors in Kandahar voted for a wrecking ball by inviting the Taliban back in, because they were so exasperated by the corruption of the US-backed Karzai government that they were like, I want someone who's going to break this system. The problem is that spoilers are exploiting the indignation. I don't view, just based on the personalities, as you suggest, who have been appointed, it's, to me, more of the same. It's the same elites. It's the private sector version. To me, it's an exacerbation of the same system. Now, obviously, people will disagree with me, but I don't see a fundamental challenge to material wealth is the one way of measuring value in the Trump group. I don't see that. And that's what I'm saying is the type of reform that needs to happen. Wait a second, wait for the microphone. Sorry.
It's reassuring there are millennials who chose to not exceed their parents' economic achievement. But how many of them did that by choice? And how big is the sector that got left behind, which doesn't exactly promote an idealistic point of view?
Right. I mean, that's why I said the millennials who are choosing are largely the well-to-do urban ones. The millennials who are not choosing are elsewhere. And that's a big problem. That's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of, let alone the millennials who are in abject poverty and are completely forgotten by this society. So that's what I was getting at when I said redistribution. But I do think that making the ideal for Americans to do better materially than their parents did, that is the definition of success in America is a flawed model. I really do. And so, one of the things was really interesting to me about living in Kandahar, Afghanistan for 6, 7, 8 years was the material level. Quite apart from the sort of danger level, which is a separate issue. But, we had one bathroom. Did we have hot water? We had running water. I don't think we had hot water. It's okay. I'm not trying to glorify or romanticize that, but I just feel that the comfort level that Americans consider to be absolutely incompressible, like you can't live with less than this comfort level, is ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. And when there are other things that give your life meaning, that stuff starts to fade a little bit in significance. There's another fascinating book, and it's actually written by my oldest friend, whose name is Sebastian Junger. This book is called Tribe, and I recommend it to all of you, or read his article-length version of it, which if you Google Junger, and it's Junger, PTSD, Vanity Fair, you'll get the article version. And he's got the substance of the argument in the article. You don't have to read a whole book. But he has absolutely fascinatingly discovered that the incidence of PTSD, post-traumatic stress, is going up while the lethality of conflicts is going down. And so what he's discovered is our instinctive sense that trauma triggers post-traumatic stress syndrome, which you'd think, given the name, that's what it's about. It's the opposite. Traumatic, life-threatening experiences bring people together, make them feel needed, give you an incredible sense of meaning and interconnection. And his argument is that, in fact, soldiers in platoons are experiencing that, and then they come back to this discombobulated, materialistic society, and that's what's giving them PTSD, which is a really profound, I think, argument.
Sarah, assuming that the momentum for the demand for fundamental change in the way we are governed is going to continue, can you envision either of the established parties being able to embrace and lead that change? That's
a great question, and I have to say I don't. I don't for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think they're too solidly in the hands of elites that think the way that I just described in that trend. I think, and what I'm reading is that, one party is at the moment focused on capitalizing on its victory, and I think it's going to capitalize in very materialistic ways, and the other party is focused on, I feel like, sort of tactical changes, not really hearing because there was an insurrection in the Democratic Party too that touched on some of these issues, and I don't feel like that insurrection the content of it got sufficiently listened to, again, this is my personal view, by the party leadership. And the other thing I feel is that, and what I'm really driving at with this trend is we are focused on how polarized we are politically, but what I'm saying in this trend is that the elites of the two parties are actually joined at the top in terms of their worldview. And what we really have at the top of the two parties is a rivalry. It's a competition. It's not a profound qualitative difference. But the partisanship is dividing the regular folks. And that has gotten so bitter that it's blinding the regular folks to understanding the degree to which their interests are being held in common. And that is extremely powerful, and it's been extremely successful in dividing people who really are dissatisfied by very similar things. So, and I think that partisan and the painting of people in colors and all of this stuff may make it difficult for people to sit down and have a conversation about what it is that really moves them or concerns them across the party lines. And I think the language has gotten extremely offensive on both, that people are reacting very strongly to buzzwords that the other side is using and making it hard to hear, the substance beneath it. So I don't know if that means we need a third party, but I do think that the reform movement has to not be attached to one party or the other. It has to be attached. All right. The short answer, gal, I'm not. So I believe that we need a definition of we that is accessible to every American. Right. Not that every American will choose to affiliate to it, and not that every American's behavior will, live up to it. But I think it has to be a definition of we that is ethically based, that's based on a series of shared fundamental ethical principles. And you sign up to that, and then on the basis of that, you duke it out on the policy options. But one of them has to be, you don't seek the eradication of the politically opposite tendency, because as a species, we need both innovation and conservatism. We need both of those. They're both necessary. And so how we make it as a species has to be out of the interplay between those two tendencies. So the idea that you rig the system, or you seek or you desire the eradication of the other party is actually counterproductive. I mean, it's maladaptive, if you will. And I would say that, and this is, I'm stealing from Sebastian too, what he found as he was researching tribe is that by talking to marriage counselors, he found that when you get to use of contempt, of contemptuous language in a marriage, you're going to get divorced. You're going to get divorced. And so if we want to continue living together as a country, there's certain type of language that we simply cannot use within our survival group. If we've decided that the United States population is our survival group, that's got to be one of the ethical principles, is you don't seek the eradication of another tendency within your survival group. There are a couple of other tendencies. But I feel like it's a movement based in a kind of colorblind movement, but based in an absolute adherence to those standards, and therefore you call people on it when they violate it. And Sebastian's principle is that a platoon operates that way. And that's why you see at the level of a platoon that's in combat, there is, not a lot of distinction based on born-in characteristics or political orientation or anything like that. The distinctions are made based on how you behave within that platoon. Do you vilify your platoon members? Are you there for them or not? Do you, are you a freeloader or not? That's what will get you ostracized out of a platoon.
Do you think that the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court is saying that those people with unlimited economic resources can have unlimited influence, political influence?
I do. I mean, I think that's one of the versions of writing the rules to suit people who already have amassed excessive political and economic power. Now, the one caveat that I would make is that having a lot of money doesn't guarantee you win the race. We've seen that. Spending a lot doesn't guarantee victory. You can't get into the race without a certain amount of money. So what the money is a barrier to entry. Another friend of mine, so here's another great book, so I hope you guys are all, right? You're gonna walk out and have to start getting the library, like you'll be coming to the library. This is a friend of mine called Milan Vaishnav, Vaishnav. He studies corruption in India, and he's just coming out with a book called Money and Muscle in Indian Politics. And he is really looking at the fact that, there's a very high rate of criminality among the Indian political class. Like 1/3 of the members of parliament are under indictment or are convicted of crimes, and it's like murder. I mean, So he asked why. And one of the reasons is the barrier to entry, is the monetary barrier to entry. I mean, there are kind of three types of people who have enough money simply to get into the race in Indian politics. One is very wealthy individuals. One is like Bollywood stars or cricket stars, people who, through show entertainment have a lot of money. And the third is criminals. So if we raise the barrier to entry into politics, I mean, there's a whole variety of problems that opens the door to.
I think we should have one more question.
Really? We just got started. How about back there, because we've been in front. There are two back there, two boys. Yeah, there's one in black and brown and one in red and green.
Which brings you to the issue of campaign finance reform, a subject which was absent by the deafness through the whole campaign.
Stunningly absent in the campaign.
A brief foray by Larry Lessig when he...
Yes, indeed. Yep.
But my question is, isn't campaign finance reform perhaps the most important practical issue that our country should have on its plate? And if not, what are your thoughts? And would we be able to affect the kind of revolutionary change in the way our government is run through campaign finance?
I think campaign finance reform is indeed probably the most important political reform that we could do. But if you've been listening to me, I actually think what we need to do in this country goes a layer deeper than that. Because so long as we continue to say that material goods are the means by which we value ourselves, it's going to be really hard to affect campaign finance reform. And that's the one place I part company with Larry Lessig, is his idea is don't change the idea that lots of money needs to be in politics, just give everyone a voucher. And I'm like, we are not going to get there from there by that route, because that still glorifies the, inundation of a civic exercise with money. So there's another great philosopher, Michael Mandel, who's, I think his book is called What Money Can't Buy. And he looks at a couple of experiments that show in very different environments that when people are recompensed with money for doing a kind of civic activity, they do less of the civic activity. It's a really fascinating, and I bet we've all experienced it even on a personal level. When you want to be generous to someone, it really feels good and you want to do something for them. But when that becomes contractual, you kind of resent it. Like when suddenly you've signed a contract and they're going to pay you money to do whatever this thing is, you know, like let them use your house or something like that. It just doesn't feel the same. And so I agree with you that practically campaign finance reform is necessary. I think this country has been rocked by such deep crisis that it implies that it's deeper into our collective psychology that we need to work. Sir.
Hi, Sarah, and thank you for your very wonderful words. You're terrific.
Thank you.
My question is, it has seemed to me that a big threat to reform of any kind is the phenomenon that's now called post-truth.
Yeah.
Which is where if I tell you that up is down, and I'm willing to really get up in your face about it and just keep saying that up is down and keep at it, eventually my fact substitutes for what used to be fact, and you just you can't even agree on where to start. Have you thought about...
It's a profound problem that we are now encountering. And in fact, that would be one of my ethical principles that's the basis of the version of we that everyone has access to, is that judgment be formed on the basis of evidence and reason. But I would like to do a little bit of bipartisan or nonpartisanness here too. When you claim to be and trumpet and raise the flag, wave the flag about we are the reality-based community, you can't be telling Goldman Sachs that, you know, you've got one version of events for the public and another version of events for the private. I mean, I have seen so many, okay, can bring it back down to Afghanistan. May 2nd, 2011. Raid in Pakistan kills Osama bin Laden. I happened to be flying from Kabul to Kandahar that day. I arrive in Kandahar. By the time I arrive, the picture of Osama bin Laden's house is available on the Washington Post. And I know there are a couple of Afghans in the room. I wonder if you had the same experience I did, or particularly people who have any experience of Pakistan at all. You just had to glance at that house to know that's a safe house. No question. I didn't even know it was in Abbottabad, which is West Point. You don't have a gigantic razor wire protected house in the town whose only purpose is to put out your military officers, and that's not a safe house. It's impossible. How many of you heard the United States, the truth-based, right, United States government tell us that our ally Pakistan was harboring our enemy number one, Osama bin Laden? Right. So I'm not trying to make a false equivalency here. What I'm saying is that when the side that makes the most hash about how it is based in evidence and reason plays fast and loose like that, you open the door, you just open the floodgate to people saying, well, anything means anything. And so I think your point is an excellent one, and I think every single one of us needs to look in the mirror. Thank you very much. I'm going to be hanging out up here to sign books for anyone who wants to, like, not like, you know, I'm like pushing you toward the kitty or anything like that. But if you do want to get a book, I'd be happy to sign it for you. And if I had some soap from Kandahar, I would have brought that too, but that'll be for next time. Thanks
And books are still for sale in the lobby via Elm Street Books. And thank you again, Sarah. We'll get the signing all set up. And if you want to get your book signed, please line up on the left-hand side of the room over here.